Hebrew word for Ecclesiastes, and Job. They're called wisdom texts mainly, I think, because of the high occurrence of the word chokhmah, which is the word for wisdom. It occurs in some form over 318 times in the Hebrew Bible, and over half of those 318 appear in Job, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs. So it's a lot like a high occurrence makes you a wisdom text, but there are some other things that we'll identify that the wisdom texts share in common. In Hebrew, the word chokhmah is translated as wisdom, but when we look it up in the lexicon, it has a few other possible translations. One is skill or ability. Another is cunning or cleverness. And then there's the sailor's skill of steering the ship. So you think about those wide ranges, nothing has a lot of knowledge. It's quite interesting that that's how wisdom is possibly translated. I tend to think of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible as a guidance through the sea of life. How is it we navigate life in relationship with the holy and with our neighbors? So, there's also the understanding of rules of the game of life. Some of you may have played the game Life somewhere in the past with the little cars and the little pegs, blue for boys and pink for girls and all those things. But wisdom is, for the Hebrew Bible, again, this kind of what we do in order to reflect the divine image that is within each of us. How we get wisdom is not clear in the Hebrew Bible. Some think that there was a group of sages that came up with all the wisdom texts. Others think that it's more like family gatherings, times around the campfire, when older generations, more experienced generations share wisdom with those who are newer in life and still trying to figure it out. I tend to lean more on that. We know that there were schools in ancient Israel later in their history, probably not before about 9th century BCE. So it wasn't like kids went to school to learn. They would have stayed in the home and learned what they could while they were at home. And then particularly for boy children, they would go out and work with the other males in gathering and hunting. And the females would stay at home and continue to learn things like how to make pottery, how to create clothing, all the things you needed to sustain life in that very agriculturally based, intensive agriculturally based culture. But again, it could be that there were later developments in which there were schools where students developed their own understandings. Certainly as we see it play out in Judaism, rabbinic schools have that role of sharing wisdom and learning about the ancient texts and the ancient faith for rabbis and other leaders in Jewish communities. Here are some things, though, that all three wisdom texts in the Hebrew Bible have in common. And it's really what they lack from the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So if you read through Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, you have no mention of the promise to the ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Rachel, Jacob and Leah. None of that is ever referenced in these three texts. You have no mention of the Exodus story or of Moses. Now, when you think about Moses as being this teacher, you would think that Moses would show up. There's no covenant mentioned where the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Sinai. And there's no mention of a Davidic covenant either. So they are all missing the things that we see woven throughout the narratives and the prophetic and poetic texts of the Hebrew Bible. We'll consider why in a moment. They do share some things in common that aren't about what they lack. And that's their theological perspective or their view of life. So really, for wisdom texts, wisdom comes from lived experience. Not going to school, not having all these letters after your name that Kathy so wonderfully named for me. That is not a guarantee of wisdom. They search for wisdom in the natural order. And they probably get some of this from their encounters, particularly with Egyptian culture. In some of the Egyptian culture, we learn that there was actually a secretary of the pantheon of gods named Thoth, who brought down writing and understanding to the scribes of the Egyptians. But for the most part, everything had to do with observations of nature. So if you look at those early hieroglyphs, they are actually pictures in which they are claiming that in nature you can learn what you need to know about God, about how to live, or in the Egyptian case, about the gods and how to live. And Israel shares some of that. As you look, especially if you're reading in some of Ecclesiastes, it talks about nature as a source of wisdom. Therefore, there is a huge emphasis on the role of God as creator. That shows up everywhere pretty much in the sections of the Hebrew Bible, but here in these three texts, God as creator is primary. There are other ways of knowing God, but that's the primary role. And one of the things we find particularly in Ecclesiastes and Job is skepticism. They're questioning what they've been taught. They're questioning what they think is true. And some say that the skepticism we find in these texts was to keep the faithful from being overconfident. Now, I like that idea. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get a little confident in what I think I know about God and about everything else in the world. And skepticism calls into question the things you think you know, not to cause you to let them go, but to cause you to know why you believe them and how you know them. It's one of the things seminary does for students too. I tell them they come to seminary with this fat suitcase of all their things they've been taught about their faith. And when they get to seminary, we pop open that suitcase and start going through it and asking, do I still believe this? Why? Do I want to hold on to this? Why? Oh, this is a belief I thought I held, but now I don't, so I'm going to leave it over here. So skepticism just keeps us humble, I think, as a way that wisdom texts remind us. There's also a concern with mortality. Not so much a complete dread of death, but a recognition that death is inescapable. There is no way every human being, from the royalty to the people who are working in the sewers, every human dies. That's the great equalizer in wisdom literature. And again, thinking that through reminds me, did any of you all see the movie What About Bob with Bill Murray? Yeah, and there's a young boy in the movie who's laying in bed talking to Bob, and he says, we're all going to die. There's no escaping it. We're all going to die. That's what I think of with wisdom literature. It's just this understanding we're all going to die, but then you don't have to let that keep you from living, as we see beautifully expressed in Ecclesiastes. So I'm going to start with Koheleth, or Ecclesiastes. Not everybody reads it. How many of you have read Ecclesiastes lately? Oh, good. A little bit about the name. In Hebrew, Koheleth comes from the Hebrew word kahal, which means congregation or gathering. And Ecclesiastes is the name of the book in Greek. Ecclesia, you may have heard before, means a congregation or a gathering. So many think that the person mentioned in Koheleth or Ecclesiastes might have been someone who gathered a group of people in some sort of context, educational or religious, in order to have conversations and to learn together about what we can know about the world around us. There is one reference to David in the epilogue of Ecclesiastes, in which the author is referenced as a son of David, which might have been connecting that text to Solomon, who, you may remember, Solomon was the wisest leader of them all. Why? He asked for wisdom, that's what he got, and then he, went astray for lots of different reasons. And since Solomon is so connected to wisdom, that it's not unusual that in Ecclesiastes we at least hear one reference to a son of David. In fact, there's one theory that Solomon wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon. And this theory goes, this was legend, that when he was a young man full of lust, he wrote the Song of Songs, all that love poetry. Then as he grew into an adult, he was all about Proverbs, which is, this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. And then as he got to the later days of his life, he wrote Ecclesiastes, which, if you've read it, is kind of not always certain about life, kind of seems exacerbated at times, as many of us do as we age. And I tell students, I love Ecclesiastes now. When I was a young professor, I couldn't see any value in Ecclesiastes whatsoever. I wanted answers. I wanted them now. Ecclesiastes doesn't give us that. So, this is this text from the epilogue. The teacher also taught the people knowledge. Again, Kahal, the leader, Koheleth, could be a teacher or a convener. Weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs, the teacher sought to find pleasing words, wrote words of truth plainly. The sayings of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is weariness of the flesh. I can tell you my students love that line. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep God's commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Usually we date the final compilation of Ecclesiastes to around 300 BCE. Remembering that the Israelites, and later what were known as the Jewish people, were in Babylon in exile to about 538. When they returned to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, they spent a lot of time trying to rebuild the temple, the city walls, the community, and that's when we think they really got serious about writing down their sacred texts or preserving their sacred words. And so, of all the texts in the Hebrew Bible, the Ecclesiastes is probably one of the latest, we think, before it was finally all combined and looks like what we have. We know that by 150 BCE, it was known beyond the circles of the scribes or whoever put this together. So by about 150 BCE, everyone in the Jewish community around had knowledge of a book called Koheleth. Just a side note, I don't know if the rabbi covered this when he was here a while back, but the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K. And that's an acronym to remind us of the three sections of the Hebrew Bible. T stands for Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. N stands for Nevi'im, which is prophets. that runs from Joshua all the way through the last written prophet. And K stands for Ketuvim, the writings. And in that order, we think these texts kind of gained authority. So first the Torah, then the prophets, and the writings were still being compiled and collected much later than any other part of the Hebrew Bible, and that's where you find Ecclesiastes. So, the language, we notice when you read it, particularly in Hebrew, that there is repetition of certain words or phrases. Like you find the word toil a lot, work, sun, death, wicked. So there seems to be some kind of threading that keeps all these disparate pieces of the book together with this repetition of phrases and shared theology. So what do we call Ecclesiastes? Some have called it a royal testament. If you buy into the idea that Solomon's writing this in his later years, then the royal testament is Solomon sharing all that he knows before he dies. Others say it's like a treatise, like, some theologian sitting down to write what they think is the right way of believing and acting and understanding God and the world around them. There are collections of sayings, admonitions, reflections. We find in the text of Ecclesiastes the phrase, "I gave my heart to know," or "I know," which probably meant I wanted to find answers, or I went to seek for answers. Some think of it as a journal or a diary where, every once in a while whoever wrote it just sat down and jotted down their thoughts for that moment. And that's why we don't see a lot of thematic unity in the whole of Ecclesiastes. And I think for our time today, we would call Ecclesiastes a blog. I mean, it really does at times seem to reflect a personal crisis of faith. One who has put years into studying and searching after the meaning of life, but finally realizes it's all futile. You're never going to understand God and why things happen, so don't worry yourself with it. And perhaps this person, in the quest for truth, has let life pass them by and missed out on the joys of living. So the reflections, the blog, if you will, is advice for others so that they not make the same mistakes. Like one of some people's favorite lines, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die." Don't miss out. Live in the now. But I don't know. I don't have a blog, so I'll fuss to that. And sometimes when I read the blogs of others, I think, really, you thought I needed to know that you were thinking that? Or that you went to the grocery store today and couldn't decide on what kind of orange juice to buy? So some might have thought about Ecclesiastes in a similar way as it was making its rounds in the community. So here are some key themes of Ecclesiastes. Vanity. Now, how many of you have heard vanity of vanities, everything is vanity? That's a repetition in Ecclesiastes. The problem is vanity is a bad translation. And many of you have heard me say this before, that some of our Bibles don't have the best translation. The word translated as vanity is the word hevel, which is also the same word used for Abel in Genesis 4. And it actually means vapor or breath, something insubstantial. If you think about the story of Cain and Abel, Abel doesn't last long on the stage because Cain kills him. For many of those ancient audiences, hearing the storyteller name this second son Abel, Hevel, that was foreshadowing that he wasn't going to be around very long. So, but a lot of people wouldn't like if you said vapor of vapors. instead of vanity of vanities. It's the way in Hebrew, the way it's structured, to say the superlative. The best, the est, as we talk about, biggest, grandest. So vapor of vapors, the greatest vapor. And I think that again reminds us that everything in life is utterly futile or impermanent. You'll never figure it out. There's often no rhyme or reason to life, so enjoy it while you can. Go, eat your bread in gladness, and drink your wine in joy, for God has long ago approved of what you do. This was a benediction that a minister, I was at a wedding, and this minister used it as the benediction for the couple. It's the charge. And I thought, how wonderful. Go, eat your bread with gladness, drink your wine with joy, for God has long ago approved of what you do. Too bad I didn't know this with my mom when I was a teenager. Another common theme is this idea of fear of the Lord. Now, when we hear fear of the Lord, we think of being afraid, right? Like shaking in our boots. But really, in this context, fear should be understood more as awe or respect. Fear of the Lord means you realize you are not God. And for many humans, that's a big step, is when they realize they are not God. That God is ultimately in control of the world, and really humans will never understand all the reasons for God doing things or allowing things to happen. So fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Understand you are not God. And from that, the rest might come more easily to us. I had a professor of Hebrew Bible who was actually Roman Catholic by tradition, but when she introduced herself to a new group of students, she called herself a God-fearer. One who understood that I am not God and I cannot control God or what happens all the time around me. Joy is another common theme. I think maybe this was perhaps someone trying to put a little joyful spin, a positive spin on all those kind of you're going to die, so just get it over with and move on. But it's also just recognizing that you accept what's happening around you and not maybe understand it. But that doesn't stop you from enjoying life while you can. Enjoying life while you can. I don't know, I'm a sometimes Kenny Chesney fan, and he had a song, Don't Blink, and it talked about an older man saying, don't blink, because before you know it, life will pass you by and you'll be at the end of your journey. So don't waste it. Don't spend all your time trying to figure out why and how and if, but just have the awareness of what's around you. So here's this first text that often is the one where everybody starts out. In Ecclesiastes 1, the words of the teacher, Kahal, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, or vapor of vapors, says the teacher, all is vapor, all is wispiness, all is impermanent. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hurries to a place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where streams flow, there they continue to flow. So you see that kind of just circle of life, And when it says the sun hurries wherever it goes, remember they thought the sun came up and went here and then went somewhere else to come back to go do it again. They didn't have a round world theory as we have. And verse 9, what has been is what will be. What has been is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. That phrase, I think, is something we would be able to state without any hesitation today. That as much as we advance as human beings, there's some things that never change. As much as we think we know, there's always things that we'll never know. So remember that skepticism. Don't get too confident and think you have it all figured out. Another passage that I think is kind of intriguing. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same fate befalls them all. Everybody's going to die. Whether you're wise or not, you will have the same fate. Then I said to myself, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? End of your life. It's not going to push death away if you have all this knowledge. Maybe I'm no better than the fool. It goes on to say, because sometimes one has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill, must leave all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it. It's a great line too. All you're doing now, you may never get to enjoy, because the next generation will enjoy your hard work. And then again, there is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. And then there is the most well-known Ecclesiastes 3, and I didn't put the most famous part of it. There's a time to die and a time to live. You know that kind of phrasing. Turn, turn, turn by the Birds was the song that picked that up. But what I really like is this last part where it says, God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, God has put a sense of past and future into their minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I like that. God gives us a sense of time. Gives us a sense of the importance of the past and looking towards the future, but living in the now. And again, the fate of humans, the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vapor. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. That reminds us of the second creation story where God forms Adam from the Adamah, and later says, from the ground you were taken, to the ground you will return. And for people who love animals, this is also a nice line. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of the animals goes downward to the earth? Or maybe we all go to the same place. And I have only had to do 2 funerals by myself in my time in ministry. Remember, I became a professor. That's not what I was going to spend my time doing, but I have had those honors of presiding at funerals. And one of the things I love to use is this text from Ecclesiastes 12. And particularly to the end, where it says, before the silver, here, let me back up. When one is afraid of heights and terrors are in the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because all must go to their eternal home. And the mourners will go about the streets before the silver cord is snapped and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern. And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. What a beautiful image of death. That which is of the earth, our bodies, goes back to the earth. And that very breath of God that is within us returns to its source as well. One of my favorite texts in Ecclesiastes. So just a few closing thoughts on that before I see if you have some thoughts or questions on your own. This is a quote from a website I found that was kind of an intro to Ecclesiastes. The book's honest and blunt appraisal of the human condition provides a healthy corrective to occasionally excessive self-assurance of other wisdom writers. Its radical skepticism is somewhat tempered by the resigned conclusions to rejoice in whatever gifts God may give. And those citations of all the places where it says to enjoy the gifts that God has given, whether it's eat, drink, and be merry, or go and eat your bread with gladness and drink your wine with joy. So thoughts, questions? Yes, Kim?
I don't remember you explaining who they think wrote Ecclesiastes. Did I miss that?
The question was, who do we think wrote Ecclesiastes? The short answer is we don't know. That one verse who ties Koheleth to David could have been added later as a superscription to give it some tie to the other wisdom literature. It could have been a sage. It could have been a king. It could have been someone just common who's writing down their thoughts. Or more than likely, I think it was a collection of texts that were all surrounding these same ideas of mortality and the impermanence of life and the idea of joy and trusting that God is God and you are not. But we don't know for certain who wrote it. And since we think it came about so late, again, it probably was a collection of sources like that. Imagine someone coming upon your diary, if you keep it, or your blog in later years after you're long gone. And they think, oh, there's some value here, so let's take some of this and put it into a collection of part of our sacred texts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, Kath.
I compliment you on your wisdom from speaking this to this class, because it's very timely for all of us, I would think, to get this perspective kind of clear in our lives again, because we're all in the sunset years. And I think this is a beautiful, beautiful way to look at life, and especially at this point in our lives. So thank you.
Over here.
I would certainly agree with that in terms of just relaxing and just enjoying every day. Having said that, though, it kind of doesn't deal with the human desire to kind of leave a footprint. To leave a footprint for the positive while you are living. Do something good. And that sometimes is bigger than what you can accomplish. So you say, what good can I do? Very little, probably. But, it's like throwing away something in a trash can instead of leaving it on the street. In just a small way, you're doing something good. And I think that that's the kind of concept that even though you can't change anything, you can try in a small way to change things.
And there's a little bit of that in Ecclesiastes. I just didn't pull out those particular parts. But yeah, there is that sense of enjoying life and leaving something for the next generation. You know, it said your toil today may not be enjoyed, but by those who come after you. So I hear a little bit of what you're saying is, yes, what we do today, no matter how small, we're moving a little bit towards, in my mind, what the holy imagined in what the world could be. So good point. I honestly didn't pick this because I thought you were in the later stages of your life. Because as I said, it's good for me to remember, especially, I think that to me is the thing that humanity shares pretty much across the board, is the sense of trying to control life and control what's going to happen, and to believe you can make the world the way you want it to be. You can make choices, I firmly believe, and you can choose how you're going to live your life, but ultimately, fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, recognizing that God is God. Now, I'll admit, I'm not good at this. Don't hear me preaching. Hear me sharing that I want to control things. I want to figure out why God let that happen. And we should ask some of those questions. But it's not bad if we don't ever get a satisfactory answer in this world. Now, I don't remember. We go till 10:45. Okay.
Yeah, we got one back here.
All right, great.
I really just didn't ask you how long.
I like it.
So it's been interesting to me to see, as I get into my 70s, that people are actually telling me that they like to hear what I have to say because they think I have wisdom, which I never heard that in my 60s or my 50s or my 40s. So I love your words that describe what wisdom is, because I'm feeling like I have it, but I'm not really sure, even though I may be bluffing all those other people who think I have it. So I love your take on it, your explanation of it. It was really fulfilling for me. Plus, I'm a little... I know you didn't purposely talk to us in our sunset years, but it's really good to kind of understand that everything goes away and there's nothing you can do to control that.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. So thank you, Lisa.
Sure. And sometimes I think when we think we have wisdom, that might be a sign that we don't yet have wisdom. Wisdom, people come looking for your wisdom more than you thinking you have wisdom all the time. So. Anything else?
Anybody else?
All right. Let me see what I had next on here. Oh, I just had Koheles' valued witness that reminds us of the mystery of the holy. So as a teaser for what we're going to do next week, I'm going to talk about the wisdom text par excellence, which is the book of Job, which is another text that I think we all should read at least once every couple of years because they're good lessons. So just to remind us, when you read from Genesis through Chronicles, let's say, you see a pattern develop, particularly around Deuteronomy, and then in Joshua and Judges it just takes off, in Samuel and Kings. And that is the way people explain why bad things happen in these texts is that they did something wrong. So you do something wrong, something bad happens, or you will suffer for it. Proverbs kind of props that up. You know, if you do this, honor your father and mother, blah, 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 life will be good, etc., etc. When we get to Ecclesiastes, we see that it's not that simple of an either or. Bad things happen because you were bad, or good things happen because you were good. When we get to the book of Job, we often call it a crisis of faith. And the way I describe this in my own words is that the exile was an experience that not everybody went to Babylon, but everybody felt the Babylonian Empire's impact on their lives. And especially for those who did go into exile, you can imagine them sitting there going, what did we ever do to deserve this? Now, those texts of Samuel and Kings especially tell them very clearly, you broke covenant, God gave you every chance to change, you didn't, so this happened. But we're in the aftermath of that, and we may even be in a generation that didn't experience the exile as adults. Maybe they were children, maybe they were born in exile, who wondered, well, we didn't do anything wrong, but we still got the shaft. Come on, what's going on here? Another line from one of my favorite movies, Christmas Vacation. We ain't done nothing wrong, and we still got the shaft. And so those old pat answers of you reap what you sow just weren't cutting it anymore. They couldn't understand why these things had happened. They had lost the promised land, they had lost the temple, and they were now living in a land where they were ruled by people who didn't know who their God was or had gods of their own. So trying to figure out the why, we think, is what gave rise to Job's presence in our Bibles. Job is the place where people say, it can't be you reap what you sow. Or another way of thinking about it is, why do good people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's what Job is trying to figure out with a story that helps us try and understand one explanation for why bad things happen to good people. Now, there's also a wonderful book by Harold Kushner about when bad things happen to good people, and I recommend it as well. But Job comes along. We also think its compilation was a very late piece. It's also found in the writings. We think at least 2 or 3 editings happened with the book of Job to get what we have now. And all of that were later generations rearranging things to make it fit their own theology. The structure of Job is where we really see that there's been some editing. So if you looked at the book of Job, and I don't think I have it here, I will next week, but you have a prose chapter and a half in the beginning, or 2 chapters, and then you go into all this poetic material before you come back at the very end of the book in chapter 42, and you return to a prose story. So one theory is that the prose story, that is the beginning where there's this very righteous guy who did nothing wrong, but because God wanted to prove that this was one righteous dude, God took the bet with Hasatan to see if Job would lose faith in God if he were to suffer. And so you have this opening couple of scenes, and in all of that, Job did not curse God. Jump over the poetry, and you can pick up at the end and say, and then all of Job's friends and family came, and Job got all this stuff back, and he lived a long life. We think that was once a folk tale that probably existed in lots of different cultures with slightly different aspects. The names have been changed, but the story is the same. And Israel either borrowed one from one of their neighbors or developed their own. But there are several parallels to the story of Job in other cultures that surrounded Israel. And we'll look at those next week. I've already mentioned date and authorship. The ancient Near Eastern parallels, we'll look at those next week, but it's a sense that every culture, probably throughout history, but particularly when Israel was developing and their texts were developing, every culture had a story of a righteous sufferer. Someone who was put through hell and maintained their faith. But But there are some differences in what Job's story ends up with and what those other parallel stories ended up with. And one of the hints I'll give you is that in those ancient Near Eastern parallels, the God never shows up to talk to the sufferer. But in Job, God does show up and there's a conversation.
I have always been troubled by the fact that God is perfect and God cannot be tempted. But in the story of Job, it seems like God is tempted. And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, just briefly, and I promise next week we'll delve into it even more. But yes, the way that folktale goes is that God takes a bet to prove God's whatever. It's a hubris moment. It's a moment where God is saying, I bet my servant Job will not suffer, or will not lose faith if you suffer. And in fact, when you read the story as it goes, the first time we're in heaven, in the heavenly court, when God and all the other beings and Hasatan gather, Hasatan never mentions Job. It's God who says, hey, look there's Job, bragging. And then when Hasatan says, well, let bad things happen and he'll curse you, God could have said, no, he won't. Okay, next on the agenda, move on. But this story says God took it and was tempted. Now, another spin on that I read into Job later is maybe God had faith that Job was doing it for the right reasons. And to me, that's a message we need to hear, that God has faith in humanity, that we do things for the right reason and not to get the cheese at the end of the maze of life, however you define cheese, whether it's heaven or something else. So great lead in, and what do they call it? A teaser for next week, where we'll look more closely at Job. This is a text I have spent a lot of time with and just think it's just a wonderful way of expressing humans and our understandings of God and trying to explain unjust suffering. What we in theology call theodicy. There's a good God. Why do bad things happen to good people? So next week, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. We look forward to next week.